This is Peter Laws in Norman, Oklahoma. On the air since 1987, you're tuned to the International Radio Report, 30 minutes of radio about radio every Sunday morning on CKUT 90.3 FM in Montreal and live streaming around the globe at ckut.ca.
Welcome, everyone, to the International Radio Report on CKUT 90.3 FM in Montreal and on the web, ckut.ca. It is Sunday, April the 2nd. We thank you for tuning in once again to our show. My name's Sheldon. I am here with Jill. We have 30 minutes of news and information for you from the world of radio, both here and around the world. Our email address, if you'd like to contact us, radioreport@yahoo.com. We're live streaming and archived at ckut.ca. We have a Facebook group, International Radio Report, with 908 members. We welcome Tran, Stuart, and Murray to the group this week. And our YouTube channel, look for International Radio Report on YouTube, and we have 810 subscribers there, and you'll find the most current show plus back copies of older shows that you can listen to there. And as we mentioned last week, we are now also up on the Internet Archive, where we've got several hundred shows, I guess, now posted up there that you can go back and check out as well. So lots of different ways to track down the current and past editions of our show, the International Radio Report. We'll start off today's show with information about our CKUT funding drive. It is officially completed as of March the 26th. The goal was $45,000. The station is just slightly under that as we're recording today. They have decided to keep the pledge possibilities open until the end of May. So even if you miss the actual funding drive, you still have time to go in and make a pledge. The easiest way to do that is go to ckut.ca and there's a donate button. You can click on that and just follow the instructions of how to make your pledge to support CKUT. And we'd just like to thank those of our listeners who generously contributed to this year's funding drive. We thank the following people: Thomas Beaton, Ron Cesarek, Eric Cottrell, Mickey Delmage, Mark Drager, Natalie Ellis, Todd Holzman, Ron Hunsicker, Brent Johnson, Ricky Lung, Sheila Lassard, Sarah Mangle, Ian Millett, Kevin Murray, Brian Penny, and Mario Torino. And we thank all of you for your contributions. We did really, really well for our two half-hour shows. Probably some of the best responses of any of the programs for shows that only have a half hour each week to put out our call. So we do thank everyone who took the time to make a pledge. And keep watching. You might end up being one of the prize winners. Yep. A lot of nice prizes being given away shortly for people who made pledges. So maybe you'll get a nice little surprise in return for your support.
Yep. Thank you, guys. And another year of amazing programming on CKUT. So we have in our first news story, Indigenous leaders that are calling for a minimum of commercial radio airplay quota. And this is by Connie Thiessen, Broadcast Dialogue. Political leaders and Indigenous artists gathered in Montreal on Tuesday to demand that the CRTC introduce a 5% minimum quota for Indigenous music content on commercial radio. The demand is based on the recommendation of the Mémoire sur le contenu musical autochtone, or Memorandum on Indigenous Musical Content, the result of a public consultation conducted last summer, spearheaded by Indigenous record label Makusham Music in collaboration with Innu Takuaikan, the Innu First Nations band government in Quebec, found that 94.83% of the 312 Canadians surveyed believed a percentage of Indigenous music content should be imposed on commercial radio stations in Quebec and Canada, expressing that they almost never hear Indigenous music on the radio. Roughly 129 survey participants, more than 41%, were members of an Indigenous community. Although the Indigenous music industry is booming in Canada, the presence of our artists in commercial radio remains an occasional occurrence. says Matthew McKenzie. In a statement, the memorandum we are unveiling today demonstrates how endangered indigenous languages truly are and why their preservation is essential. In fact, it is a concern that is shared by the vast majority of survey respondents, whether indigenous or non-indigenous. Respondents generally agree that a 5% indigenous music quota should be imposed on commercial radio stations. Indigenous music must take its rightful place on all broadcasting platforms, especially on commercial radio, added Chief Mike Polash McKenzie. Music is a universal language that contributes to creating ties between peoples and allows us to tell our story by bringing our vision of the world to life. Across Canada, Indigenous musical artists are ambassadors of their nations, and their work enriches Canadian society as a whole. Their art actively contributes to keeping our languages alive and perpetuating the millennial teachings of our elders. A CRTC spokesperson confirmed receipt of the memorandum on Indigenous musical content, saying that in order to be considered, it will have to be presented through a process of consultation. This issue is related to a change in policy and will be examined in the upcoming consultations related to Bill C-11 if and when it receives royal assent. And in the Indigenous Broadcasting Policy Review, the commission's spokesperson told Broadcast Dialogue in an email response. The Commission's radio review, unveiled in early December, laid out an expectation that commercial radio broadcasters include Indigenous music in their playlists without setting specific quotas, noting it continues co-development on a new Indigenous broadcast policy with the public consultation phase upcoming. Upon release of the radio review, the CRTC said a follow-up proceeding would seek comments on Canadian content development, including how to ensure better contributions to Indigenous and diversity initiatives. So this is definitely an interesting story. We do not hear anything or almost anything Indigenous. And it does have its place in the commercial radio stations for sure. It's always a debate. We were talking just before we started recording about even how French language music quotas are always stirring up a debate. So adding Indigenous music in the mix, it's definitely going to be something that commercial radio stations are going to want to give their own opinion on. But everybody has, I guess, needs a place for its voice. That's for sure.
I know a number of years back, I did some work at a local native radio station in Ganawage, the Mohawk Reserve just outside of Montreal. And even though that was a community radio station serving their local community, they at the time were not playing very much Indigenous music at all. And like you said, if they're not going to play it, who else is?
Yep.
So this is a really interesting initiative. I remember we put a program together because I started listening to some of this music, and it was just incredible how much good music there was being produced, not only here in Canada, but across the world by Indigenous peoples. We started to play a 2-hour show a week, and the response we got was amazing. People said, wow, even local people in the community, like, where did this music come from? How come we've never heard it? So the artists were very happy that their music was getting played. We couldn't believe how much music was available, and some of it could easily fit into mainstream radio stations. So I hope this bill goes somewhere, and that they do actually decide that there will be a quota of how much Indigenous music needs to be played by commercial stations. How happy will the commercial stations be to do this? Might be another story. But if the order comes down, then they won't have a choice. So we'll have to wait and see how this develops. We now move to the other side of the world, and a story coming to us from the Hindu Post via Radio World. It's written by Azadullah Jafari, and the headline is BBC Persian Radio Service Ends. BBC World Services announced that after 82 years of activity, the broadcasting of Persian radio programs on the network has ended. BBC Farsi Radio was one of the most popular radios with 82 years of history, launched after World War II. The Persian programs of BBC Radio in Afghanistan, especially in the villages of Afghanistan, had an exceptional reputation and also many fans. Based on the narratives of residents in Afghanistan, especially adults and the elderly, BBC Persian Radio was a reliable source of information on events in the country and the world for them. But the BBC World Service called the purpose of stopping the Persian radio activity of this network, focusing more on digital platforms. BBC is one of the world's most popular media that provides programming in different languages, including English, Russian, Chinese, Farsi, Pashto, Urdu, Turkish, Hindi, and Uzbek. Therefore, sometimes the media services of the BBC, especially the Farsi sections and BBC Farsi Radio, have been severely criticized by the people of Afghanistan and Iran. Due to this, the people of these two countries claim that some of the positions and reports of BBC Farsi were biased and partisan. But this radio's last Farsi morning program was broadcast on Sunday morning, March the 26th. It was nostalgia and a final memory for the fans and listeners to BBC Persian Radio in Afghanistan, which will not be erased from their diary. This is really bad timing, if you ask me. Broadcasting in that language to that part of the world, a part of the world that's always seems to be in turmoil, and to get accurate, trusted broadcasting in their own languages going into these parts of the world, to me, seems like a no-brainer. But 82 years, and it stopped.
You know, they cut this service, they cut the Arabic service, and you're just thinking about all of the countries that it impacts, all of it together, which are some of the countries that are in the biggest turmoil and problems on this planet, where there is a need for good, accurate information and news. Digital is nice when you get digital information through the internet and you can listen to it. But how many of these countries that are impacted here are blocking such content because they don't want you to listen to those broadcasts? How many out there are pretty much lacking infrastructure for internet access? It's crazy. It's very interesting to see that they're thinking obviously about money and obviously not really about the impact they'll have in the future.
And, you know, the leaning everything towards the new technology. Yeah, new technology is great as long as you can access it. And,
Yep.
you know, you'll hear in another story later on in the show today about how important just conventional analog radio is. And I think that story pertains to this one as well, because there are many people in these parts of the world where that little portable radio is their way to get this stuff. And, you know, the new platforms are just not going to reach them.
So what's happening with our sun? Well, our sun is still active. We are in a period of high solar activity with several sunspot groups. We had a little bit of geomagnetic storming activity again this week. We went to up to G1 class minor storms, all due to, you know, coronal mass ejections coming from the sun. And there were a few solar flares also. We even had an X flare, which is a pretty strong flare this week. So solar activity continues to be high, very in interesting ways. I don't know how many reports I've seen of people during the week that were like last week saying that the medium wave bands, none of the local stations are there, none of the usual nighttime stations are there. One day I was trying to get just WCBS, which usually is booming in on 880 kilohertz AM. And it was so weak, but there was something else. And a lot of people were saying, wow, there's a lot of Spanish language suddenly on the bands. So lots of stations from Central South America were actually booming in over the weakened local stations. And that's how propagation changes stuff. The solar flux is 140, sunspot number 99. And, well, the conditions are interesting. It's worth turning on the radio. Even if you hear that there's a geomagnetic storm, don't be one of those that say, oh, well, I'm going to leave the radio off tonight. No. Turn it on. It's very surprising what you'll hear. And, well, you got to turn it on to listen.
This is Janice of Dorval. The International Radio Report presents 30 minutes of news, information, and commentary on developments in the world of radio every Sunday morning at 10:30 on CKUT 90.3 FM in Montreal and online at ckut.ca.
So we have a story about, once again, sad story on radio here, where French radio station banned from broadcasting in Burkina Faso. This is Prensa Latina via Radio World. The government of Burkina Faso decreed today the suspension of France 24 or France 24 radio station for broadcasting an interview with the leader of one of the Islamist armed groups operating in this West African country. By opening its airwaves to the leader of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Hakim, France 24 acts as a communication media agency for these terrorists and provides them with a space to legitimize their terrorist actions and their hate speech, the statement from the Burkina government's spokesman said. The text added that, therefore, the government, in the name of the greater interest of the nation, suspends the transmission of France 24 programs throughout the national territory. Since 2015, Hakim and other Islamic armed groups have been operating in the north of this country and are currently trying to force their way into neighboring states where there is no activity of these entities and there is a population mostly of Muslim confession. Earlier this month, the station broadcast the answers of Hakim's leader, Abu Obeda Youssef al-Anabi, of 15 questions from a journalist on the French station. Burkina Faso is the second African country to cut France 24's programming following a similar decision by Mali for the same reasons. Both states also called for the withdrawal of French military forces stationed on their territories. So it's sad to see that they're blocking a source of news. Of course, good news has to give a chance to multiple sides when stories are happening. Unfortunately, you can't always choose which side cannot talk. It's, democracy is that. And it's sad that they have to block that news source just because they're unhappy of whoever they interview on the radio.
Yeah, these services like France 24 have domestic stations in these countries where they put their programming on. So it's actually quite easy to stop these stations from broadcasting if they're right there in the country. Unlike international broadcasting shortwave, where a station can be, thousands of miles away, but still getting their signal through. But in this case, it seems that it's quite easy for both of these countries now, Burkina Faso and Mali, that have stopped this type of programming on their domestic airwaves. So again, that it shows the importance of the radio signals, of getting this news out to people. And when the government doesn't like that news going out, they have ways of stopping it. Our next story takes us still in Africa, this one from Zimbabwe. It's written by Farai Mutsaka of the AP News Service. Many rely on radio broadcasts in Zimbabwe and across Africa. Just the size of his hand, the radio set hung in the busy marketplace stall is essential to Mark Nyabanda. I can't do without it, said the 25-year-old, taking a break from selling fertilizer in a market in the capital city, Harare, to listen to a radio weather report warning of possible floods. Radio bulletins also provide him with information on disease outbreaks, political news, and entertainment, he said. I don't trust these new technologies, he said, referring to social media. They're full of falsehoods. We saw that during the coronavirus outbreak. In many Western countries, conventional radio has been overtaken by streaming, podcasts, and on-demand content accessed via smartphones and computers. But in many of Africa's 54 countries, with a combined population of 1.3 billion people, traditional radio sets are widely used, highlighting the digital divide between rich countries and those still struggling to have reliable internet. Radio sets are all over the place in Zimbabwe. Rural livestock herders dangle them from their necks while tending animals, while those in the cities listen to their radio sets for news. When schools closed during the coronavirus pandemic, sub-Saharan Africa had the highest proportion of school children who lacked internet connectivity to participate in remote learning online sessions, according to the United Nations Children's Agency. Many students relied on lessons beamed via tiny solar-powered radio sets at home. More than 80% of people in Africa own a mobile phone with access to a mobile phone network, says a leading research institute. But fewer than half have mobile phones with internet access. The number of those who have access to computers at home is even lower, at 28% of people polled in 34 African countries in a survey on the digital divide published in December last year. The lack of internet connectivity means traditional radio remains king, said Afrobarometer in another survey last year. Radio is overwhelmingly the most common source of news in Africa, according to the survey. About 68% of respondents said they tuned in at least a few times a week, compared to about 40% who use social media and the internet. Traditional radio sets are easy and inexpensive to use versus the higher cost and logistical problems of getting access to the internet. Many small radio sets now come with built-in solar panels that allow people to listen to broadcasts even when they don't have electricity. Especially in vogue are radios that now also come with a cell phone charger and a flashlight. All huge conveniences in a continent where electricity outages are rampant and internet connection spots are often distant. People don't have to worry about network or data expenses, and one can't be switched off for not paying license fees, said Stanley Sware, coordinator of journalism studies at the University of Zimbabwe. The radio set has become very powerful and multifunctional, and that becomes critical in Africa, where access to power and access to the internet are very limited. Many people trust information from their radio sets over other sources, said John Musuku, a veteran radio broadcaster of 5 decades. There is a lot of disinformation and misinformation, so people still want to check. If it is not said on the radio, then it is not fact. That is why radio is popular and celebrated in Africa. Broadcasts in local languages are also attract listeners. Zimbabwe's state radio and a host of community stations offer broadcasts in Shona, Ndebele, and 12 other local languages, he said. However, the way many in Africa listen to the radio is changing as internet penetration improves. The number of people getting news at least a few times a week from either social media or the internet or both has almost doubled from 24% to 43% over the past decade, according to Afrobarometer. The falling prices of mobile phones that can access FM radio stations is also shifting how people listen to radio in Africa. There's an ongoing convergence between radio and digital mobile technologies, especially the mobile phone, he said. Radio is integrating more rapidly with the mobile phone because it is much more accessible in Africa. The mobile phone is the future of radio in Africa, but it isn't right now.
No.
And that's obvious with those numbers. And so many people just either don't believe this or don't want to believe it and think that this saturation of these other technologies is everywhere. It just isn't. And Africa is a prime example of it. So again, the importance of conventional radio. Don't switch off the radio, the analog radios. Don't go all digital like so many places are talking about doing. Just think of the millions of people that are being isolated from hearing what they need to hear if you do something like that.
You know, when you talk about statistics like they give here that say, well, you know, in some parts, 80% of the population has a mobile phone. Yeah, okay, but what exactly does that mobile phone access? It might be, you know, the internet might be on it, maybe not. It costs more to have more services, and not all of them have that service enabled on it. They also got to think about if they have data caps that where they have limited access to a number of gigabytes. They might not listen to or stream radio a lot because they're afraid they're going to go over. The other thing is, yeah, if you live in a big city, I'm sure that there's some decent service even in African countries. If you live out far from the city, we could see it here in North America, where we're technically rich countries, and it's very spotty in so many places to get internet. Imagine there, when you're in the middle of nowhere, I don't think the internet and the mobile phone works. And add the fact that, okay, you can maybe stream something on your phone to listen to news or watch some news on text form on a mobile phone, but that is all controlled by who? We just had stories of we shut down France 24 News because they're talking about something we don't want. Well, do you think France 24 is also getting on that mobile phone in that country? I don't think so. I think that's blocked also. We need radio. We need also shortwave radio and radio of all kind to get all of it across, because it's too easy to block the content of these devices.
I think some people would be shocked at the age of some of the radios that people must be using out there. Now they're getting these nice little radios with a flashlight built in and a solar panel. This is new technology for some of these users, to be able to have all those tools together in one small box that's affordable as well. Certainly not what they'd be paying for streaming and internet services and what have you. So a really interesting story, and I think it sheds a lot of light on misconceptions that many people have in the rest of the world.
So we have upcoming ham radio contests.
We'll run down this week's events coming up for you, starting with the Japanese International DX CW contest. It's 700 Zulu April 8th to 1300 Zulu April 9th. That's organized by the Japan International DX Contest Club. The objective is for amateurs around the world to make contact with Japan stations in as many of the prefectures and the Japanese islands as possible, and for amateurs in Japan to contact DX stations in as many of the DXCC entities around the world. The mode is CW, and it's all the major HF bands, 1.8 through 28 megahertz.
There's the Interest Group RTTY Worldwide RTTY Contest, 1200 Zulu April 8th to 1800 Zulu April 9th. And this is in the bands of 3.5, 7, 14, 21, and 28 megahertz, and the mode RTTY.
The Straight Key Century Club has their weekend sprintathon, 1200 Zulu April 8th to 2359 Zulu April the 8th. And it's 160 through 10 meters, no work bands. It's a CW event.
New Mexico QSO Party, 1400 Zulu April 8th to 0200 Zulu April 9th, organized by the Sandia Vista Amateur Radio Club. Contest bands are 160 through 2 meters, no work bands, of course, and the modes phone, CW, and digital.
We also have the Georgia QSO Party. That's running from 1800 Zulu April the 8th to 2359 Zulu April the 9th. It's organized by the North Fulton Amateur Radio League, 160 through 6 meter bands, phone and CW modes.
And finally, there's the Hungarian Straight Key Contest, 1500 Zulu to 1600 Zulu April 9th, so it's just 1 hour. It is organized by members of the radio club HA8KUX. The band is 80 meters. Frequencies will be between 3520 and 3570 kilohertz in CW.
All right, lots of ham radio activity coming up for the weekend. We hope you'll participate in some of those, either as a ham operator or just maybe as a shortwave listener if you'd like to check some of those out. And we'll remind you one more time, thank everybody who contributed to the funding drive and tagged their pledges for our show. You still have time, though, to go make a pledge. If you haven't done so, go to ckut.ca on the website, click the donate button, and follow the instructions. Help to push that figure over the $45,000 that the station is looking for. They are almost there as we're recording our show today, so maybe you'll be the one that can push them over the top. So ckut.ca, click on the donate button and make your pledge to support campus community radio here in Montreal.
So we're out of time.
We thank you for tuning in, and you can catch the show again if you miss it live. You can get it on our YouTube channel, and also go check out the Internet Archive to find our shows that are now posted up there as well. Thanks for tuning in. We'll talk to you again next Sunday with our next edition of the show, the International Radio Report, on CKUT 90.3 FM in Montreal. Have a great week, everybody.
Bye-bye.